far as the quiz is concerned, as I've been hearing, it was relatively easy. So again, the mechanism by which a pesticide kills or controls the target organism is its mode of action. You've probably heard that in a couple classes. And then the most commonly used term to measure a pesticide's persistence would be its half-life. And we'll hop into that a little bit later. So did you manage to get it downloaded?
It's got a minute or two left.
Okay, well, so on this slide, the only thing that's not on there is the definition of toxicology. So, chemical control is basically just all about poisons, and using poisons to control pests as kind of the last line of defense. And as such, it's really tied up in the topic of toxicology, or the science of dealing with doses and antidotes to poisons. And so this gets into sort of interesting territory around the idea of what makes a substance a poison, what can you apply that technically counts as a pesticide or a poison, and this all kind of goes way back to the birth of toxicology with this guy, Percelsus, and he was this Italian guy, father of modern toxicology, and he basically said that all substances are poisons, and that there is nothing that isn't a poison. It's just a matter of the dosage. That if something is essentially anything can kill you if you take enough of it. We just consider poisons to be those things that you have to take a very small amount of in order to kill you. And I just really like this portrait of him, just because I think it's a really good example of how people did portraits back in sort of the Middle Ages. He's just kind of sitting there. He looks a little stunned, like he's surprised to be having his portrait done. He's got two hats on, or one very elaborate hat.
One very elaborate.
I think it is one very elaborate hat, but I like to imagine he's wearing two. And then they've kind of got him holding onto the border, as if he was actually holding a sign that says, Famoso Doctor. And then in the background, there's just this random sort of cliff, nature scene. It's just very interesting. I feel like it's typical for universities to get like portraits done of their presidents and stuff. I'd love to go into the office and see like a President Castro painting of him, in front of this random nature scene. Just like
one of Trump in Trump Tower.
Oh, I'm sure. And with a random nature scene.
Yeah.
But
Like white riding bareback.
Oh yeah, great. A Putin-esque sort of portrait. Anyway, Percelsus. His basic gist was that any chemical can kill you if taken at a high enough concentration, and that poisons are really just chemicals that kill you at low concentration. So you only need a very little bit of them to kill you. So an example of this would be something like botulinum, which is arguably the most toxic substance known to humans. It's produced by the botulinum bacteria, and it's a paralytic, and as little as 1 nanogram of it per kilogram is enough to kill somebody. So a nanogram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram, I believe. And so it comes out to basically you need 0.000087 milligrams of it to kill the average American male, which comes out to about 1/500,000th of a drop of water of volume. So just a very tiny amount. Consequently, this is the stuff that is in Botox. So they just dilute it out ridiculously, and you inject it into your face and it paralyzes your face muscles. So botulism in your face. Oh, and it's a disease that's oftentimes associated with contaminated foods. So like dented cans that look all swollen from bacterial growth. That's one place you can get botulism. Moving up, or sort of moving down in toxicity, we have things like nicotine, which are slightly less toxic. It still takes about 13 milligrams to every kilogram of weight to kill you. So this comes out to, again, about 1.1 grams for a typical American male. This would be the equivalent of smoking about 750 cigarettes at the same time. So you'd have to work pretty hard. Alternatively, about 8 cans of snuff at the same time as well. So, that's a lot of tobacco. You're going to really have to work at it.
Yeah, I think your mouth only fits about half. I've seen guys do that.
Oh, well, there we go.
Half a can.
Half a can.
Top and bottom.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, chances are you're not going to be able to do it. Where you run into trouble with things like nicotine is when it's highly concentrated. Nicotine can be used as an organic insecticide, and so they're more so in the past. Neonicotinoids have really phased out nicotine because neonics have kind of cut out the human toxicity aspect of the problem. So, but back in the past when nicotine was widely used, you would get semi-regular accounts of someone getting poisoned by nicotine because they breathed in a fair amount of it while they were spraying.
Is that a safe alternative to cigarettes?
You can buy it. I forget what it's called, but you can buy like concentrated nicotine for killing pests. Well, I don't know if that'd be real wise. Moving a little further down, you have things like acetaminophen, where we're talking about a gram of it per kilogram. So we're looking at about taking 173 pills, sort of the standard 500 milligram pill to get a toxic dose for a standard sort of American male, which again is a lot of pills. It's not like you're going to accidentally take 173 aspirin, or acetaminophen. These would be Tylenols. Where you get in trouble with things like acetaminophen is that the toxicity is about 10 times higher for infants. So for young children, you're ranging between 150 milligrams per kilogram to 200. And so you get to a point where for like a 6-month-old child, if you've got like a toddler roaming around in your house, they only need to get about 2 or 3 acetaminophen pills into them before they start having a toxic reaction. And this actually got Johnson & Johnson in trouble because they were marketing children's Tylenol, which typically has a dose, you get about 160 milligrams for 5 milliliters of fluid. But then they started selling something called infant's Tylenol, which was a concentrated mix, where you give the child about 0.8 milliliters and they get 80 milligrams. And what was happening was parents were going to the store and they didn't realize that infants and children's were different in their dosage. So they'd get infants, they'd give their kid about 5 milliliters of it, and they'd basically be giving them a dose that was the equivalent to taking about a single aspirin pill. And so if you weren't real careful and you were giving them acetaminophen all day, a lot of kids were getting really sick and having to go to the hospital for toxicology problems. Consequently, Johnson & Johnson discontinued their infant Tylenol. You can't get that anymore, but there's still a lot of off-brands that are still selling it. So if you're ever child rearing, just keep an eye out for dosages on children's Tylenol. And then finally, on the extreme end, you've got things like table sugar, which, we're talking about 30 grams for every kilogram worth of weight. So you're looking at eating about a whole 5.5-pound bag of sugar in one sitting before you're going to start having a toxic reaction. And my general feeling is that if you eat 5.5 pounds of much about anything, you're going to be feeling pretty awful, whether it's sugar or drinking like a whole gallon of water or something. You're going to have a bad time. But so, with that aside, that's just to demonstrate the idea that you could theoretically kill insects, pests with most any chemical, but the dosages are going to be so ridiculous that it's going to be completely impractical to do so. And so when we talk about pesticides, what we're typically talking about in a traditional sense is just any chemical that kills a pest. And typically within the realm of kills a pest with a relatively low dose. On the flip side, we have the modern definition, which is put out there by the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, and it's kind of the guiding document for all pesticide work, where they say that a pesticide is any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any insects, rodents, nematodes, fungi, weeds, or all forms of life declared to be pests. So essentially, if the chemical has some sort of negative impact on a pest, then it's a pesticide, whether it kills it outright or just repels it. And so this is kind of their catch-all way of basically regulating all things, whether they are sort of traditional pesticides or if they are things more like, things like maybe pheromones or repellents in sort of the same area as pesticides. Yeah. So yeah, same idea there. So in IPM, where do these pesticides fall out? Because we kind of spend a lot of time in IPM talking about chemical pesticides in a different way than we talk about all the other forms of control. Whereas when we talk about cultural control, mechanical, biological, we're oftentimes talking about what are the things we can do to encourage these aspects, to ramp up the amount of different types of control we use. Whereas with chemicals, we're always talking about things like treatment thresholds, the ways that we can reduce these pesticides as much as possible. And the real place where the rubber hits the road here is the fact that a pesticide is a poison. And there's no way to get around that. That even though pesticides are very helpful, you are essentially going out and spraying some toxic substance onto food. And so we want to reduce that as much as possible, because the potential for a pesticide to injure people or injure the environment is so much higher than the ability for ladybugs to hurt people, like substantially higher. Ladybugs can be annoying, but as far as I know, they haven't killed anybody yet. Right. And so ultimately, like I mentioned, a lot of IPM is really focused around how do we reduce the usage of pesticides. And basically, pesticides are then grouped into this idea that it is just one part of the larger IPM conversation. It's one control tool that we can use in combination with a whole lot of other tools, typically as our sort of last-ditch attempt to suppress outbreaks that are occurring in the field when all our other controls have failed. Now, that being said, IPM is a process in which we need to do a lot of work, a lot of research to figure out what are the tools we can use to control pests. And in some systems, we just don't have any other good tools. And pesticides are really the most effective, or in some cases, the only control that we have. For example, things like the bloom sprays. There's no other way to really get around the fact that if you get brown rot in your almond blooms, you're going to lose a whole ton of yield. And there's not a whole lot you can do other than just spraying a fungicide on it. And so there will be some cases where it is unavoidable to use a pesticide and actually is, in some cases, really encouraged. So my point there being that there's not some one catch-all that's going to apply to all pesticides. In general, IPM discourages their use as much as possible, but in some cases, you don't really have a choice, and they can be used safely and effectively. So one of the challenges with pesticides and with teaching a pesticide section of the class is the fact that selecting a pesticide can be very complicated. On one hand, for any given pest, there may be dozens of registered pesticides that you can choose from. There may be multiple formulations within those pesticides, so that you could basically pick your chemistry, but then you might have to pick from amongst a wide range of application styles. When you're applying, there are certain techniques that will be more effective depending on what pest it is and their life stages. You need to consider how the pesticide is going to react with the crop and with the worker safety and the like, and some options will clearly be safer than others or more effective than others. And you must also be able to identify the fact that there are certain areas where you're just not allowed to use certain pesticides. The big conversation they're talking about now in California, right, is the school spray zones, that you can't spray chemicals within a certain, I believe it's 1 mile from schools at this point. And you are allowed to spray, but you cannot spray while school is in session. And so the conversation now is that they want to up that to a 2-mile radius around schools. And so you need to be aware of when you have schools near you within that radius. Parks, workplaces, areas with groundwater, because certain chemicals can't be used anywhere near any sort of groundwater sources because they may contaminate them. And also just being aware of the fact that certain pesticides just aren't going to be registered for certain commodities, or for even, in some cases, specific growth stages of certain commodities. And so ultimately, the idea is that pesticide selection can be a very complicated process, and making the very most correct choice can be difficult. And so I could spend a whole lot of time basically going through various pesticides and outlining modes of actions and all of those things, but my thinking is that that's a waste of my time, that's a waste of your time. What I'd rather do is basically go through what are the basic tools that will help you to learn about pesticides, and then help you make informed decisions about the basics of how to apply them. If you want great gobs of detail about how to apply pesticides, hopefully you had a chance to take the pesticide course or still have a chance to take it a little bit later. I've heard it's challenging but pretty good overall. So I think the number one rule for pesticides is that all the information you really need is going to be on the pesticide label. That every single pesticide that gets sold is going to have a label attached to it, and this label is going to include a whole lot of government-mandated information, including who makes it, how you can contact them, restricted use statement, so whether there are any basic restrictions about how it needs to be applied, whether you need to hire a certified applicator. It'll have all the ingredients, any signal words to communicate how dangerous the chemical is for use, and then also rules around storage and disposal. And so, and environmental hazards. This list probably keeps going on. So I'll get to the main point, which is that anytime you get a chemical, always good to check these out. If you have any questions, I have oftentimes gone to Google and said, what is this thing for this chemical? And they'll just say, look at the label. And sure enough, it is there. All of the information is there. You can get these things for free online as well. So if you're working with a chemical and you don't know where the label is, you're just a quick Google search away from a nice PDF document of it. All right, directions for use in approved settings, all of that stuff. So tons of information on the label. It's kind of like the equivalent of the syllabus in a class, right? If you have a question, check out the label. So as far as I can tell, there are 5 important variables for selecting pesticides from the IPM perspective, and those are the things I'd like to hit on for this section of the class. And that would be formulations, mode of action, persistence, selectivity, and the actual toxicity of the chemicals. So as far as formulations are concerned, they are the combination of active ingredients and inactive or inert ingredients in the product. And so really, these are 2 completely separate components of the product, but they perform separate but very important roles. Active ingredient is going to be the chemical that actually controls the pest. So if you're applying something like Zeal amiticide, it's got the active ingredient etoxazole, right? And so this is the chemical that actually goes in and disrupts the life cycle of the pest. Inert ingredients then are going to be basically any chemical that's put into the pesticide that does not kill the pest. And these basically are used to increase the utility of the pesticide. Maybe they use it to dilute it so that it's not too toxic to humans. It may enhance toxicity, make it safer to apply, easier to apply. There's any number of reasons. Some of the most common inert ingredients you may see would be things like surfactants. These are chemicals that basically stop the water from beating up so that it'll spread out over the leaf. For example, here we've got water on a nice waxy leaf. Oftentimes, if they're really waxy, the water will just bead up, and that's not a super efficient way to spread a pesticide out, so it comes into contact with the pest. So you put on a surfactant, which causes it to spread out and to coat the leaf more evenly. Things like attractant, which can serve as a bait to attract pests in to feed, or synergists. Synergists are kind of cool. These are compounds that you can add to a pesticide that will disable detoxification enzymes inside the pest. So if you've got, say, an insect that has a whole bunch of detoxification enzymes that make it resistant, there are certain synergists you can add that will disable those and make them susceptible to the pesticide again. All right. And so within active ingredients, what you will oftentimes find is that there may be multiple formulations, with formulations here being defined as the particular way in which they are applied, sort of how they are stored. Essentially, you can have liquid pesticides, things that are dusts that you may mix with water, granulars that, again, you mix with water, baits, aerosols, all sorts of things. And the choice of which is the correct formulation may really depend on the particular application that you are doing and sort of the level of simplicity that you are looking for as compared to sort of trade-offs in the field. For example, within the same within the same product, you may see something like an oil application. And oils are nice because you basically have an insecticide mixed in with an oil, you put it in your tank, you spray it, it's nice and easy. Of course, the challenge with an oil is that an oil may cause phytotoxic reactions with the crop. So if you're at a time of year, such as the middle of summer, where those reactions are going to be more severe, you may not want to go around spraying it. On the flip side, you may want to transition to something like a wettable powder, which has much lower phytotoxicity, but because it is a dust that you mix with water, anytime you pour it in somewhere, you get a lot of dust up in the air, has a sort of a higher danger to applicators if they're not being careful. And then finally, you've got things like dry flowables, which don't have dust, they have low phytotoxicity, so they're safe to put on the plants, safe for the applicators, but they tend to be abrasive for equipment, so you have to do more vehicle maintenance. So there are these trade-offs, and oftentimes it's just whatever is available to you and whatever the field conditions are like. So moving on from formulations, there's mode of action, or the MOA. So the mode of action is just the mechanism by which the pesticide kills or controls the target organism. So for example, most of these are going to be metabolic processes. So we have some sort of chemical that gets into the pest and disrupts its metabolic processes. And basically will shut down some sort of essential physiological process. For example, we've got things like organophosphates, a common insecticide, which interferes with the central nervous system, inhibiting the reception of important neurotransmitters, like we talked about in economic entomology. On the flip side, there are some pesticides which are going to be physical in nature. They will disrupt the physical barriers that protect the pest from the outer environment. This is common in things with insects like diatomaceous earth. What are some other desiccants? We'll just stick with diatomaceous earth. It's kind of neat. It's a powder that's made out of diatoms, which are itty-bitty little single-cell organisms that have a nice sort of a calciferous shell. And you can take these little shells, and they're extremely sharp, and you can spread them around like a powder, as you can see right here in this attic. And when an insect crawls over it, they get it all worked up in their joints, they get it all over their exoskeleton, and it's kind of like a death by a million pinpricks. It just cuts all these little holes in the waxy cuticle on their exoskeleton, and they start losing water to evaporation really quickly. And so you can sort of kill them that way.
So that is,
The like silica packs that you put in like shoes and to store vaccines, don't those desiccate to you? I thought that's how they work.
Those repel by aroma, don't they?
So what those guys are doing is they're actually absorbing water from the air. So they're like sort of almost like a dehumidifier. So they'll make the air more dry. The key with the insect control is going to be that you actually have to find some way for the water to be pulled actively out of the insect. So you need to cut that cuticle and create gaps for the water to leak from. So I don't know any silica gel-based approaches, but they are both desiccators in different ways. But so this is sort of a popular approach when you're dealing with pests in the house. You can sort of put a little row of sort of desiccating stuff around the walls or up on the ceilings, things like that, and anything that crawls over it will get a good bit of desiccation.
on the ceilings?
Up above the ceilings, I meant, sorry. Like, so you can, if you got dropped ceilings, you can spread it around up there and it gets any cockroaches crawling around in there.
I wanted to see you apply some diatomaceous.
Yeah. Highly effective, but just because it gets all over everything else. All right. And then one slight distinction would be site of action. So site of action would be the specific physical location that the the physical location that the pesticide is acting upon. So mode of action would be something like inhibiting cholinesterase, whereas the site of action would be sort of the neuron junction. It's the physical location in which the change happens. Sometimes you'll see distinctions between these two when you're talking about modes of actions versus sites of action in resistance control. So as far as modes of actions are concerned, there are various groups that will basically take it upon themselves to figure out what the mode of action is for all chemicals, and then categorize them according to those modes of action. For insecticides, it's IRAC, or the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. They basically are an independent group. I believe they're run out of Michigan State right now. But they look through all pesticides, they categorize them, and provide essentially a table that tells you where various insecticides fit in. They will group them by the physiological process that they disrupt, so things like cholinesterase inhibitors, and then they'll group them secondly by the specific chemical type they have. So for example, if you were looking at a chemical like imidacloprid, it would say right on the label, this is a category 4A insecticide. And if you were to go to IRAC, you could look up specifically what it does. If you went to IRAC, don't go to IRAC if you want to learn about pesticides. Or do, that's not my business. But anyway, so you would see that's a 4A, which means that it is a competitive inhibitor of the neonicotinoid receptor, or the nicotine receptor, and then you can see from A that it is specifically a neonic, as opposed to, say, a regular nicotine. Similarly, you have things like HRAC. For herbicides, there's a fungicide group as well, and they all group them. So if you go to their website, you'll end up with something like this, where you'll see all the major categories, so like acetylcholinesterases, GABAgateds, sodium channel modulators, and then under there you've got the major sections. So like 3A would be pyrethroids and pyrethrins. And if you click on this little drop-down menu, like I did here with the neonics, they'll list all the major pesticides that fall within that category, and then you can even click in and get more detail on it.
Can you search based on like insect order or weed family that you're trying to control?
Yeah, but you can't do it there, you can do it on UCIPM.
That's what I was thinking, is UCIPM will list all of the pesticides that are approved for a particular pest, but yeah, on here they won't tell you which ones they are, because that can vary by state to state.
It will even show you what you've used on that field in the prior year, so there's a history of chemical uses on UCIPM.
UCIPM's very handy. Yeah, since in California you have to report every time you apply a pesticide, they do integrate that into a database so you can see the past history of what's been on that field. The herbicide one's a little bit less user-friendly. They've got this interesting sort of beehive thing going on. I find it a little challenging to use, but it does create sort of this islands of mode of action type look. So where mode of action really matters is in terms of resistance management. Just the idea that all insects with the same mode of action are killing the pest through basically the same mechanism. And so if you keep using the same mode of action, even if they are different products, you are still selecting for the same sort of resistance mechanisms, and you will have resistance problems. And so it's generally recommended that you rotate your pesticides with those that have different modes of action, so you're not applying too much pressure on any given target inside the pest. And so if you want to know the mode of action for a pesticide, the nice thing is that you've got a label that tells you these sorts of things. So like I said before, you could go to the label. For example, here's Warrior, a common insecticide. It says right on the label that it is a group 3 insecticide. So when you're thinking about applying and you're looking at other insecticides, you can just make sure to avoid group 3s if you've already applied a group 3 that year. Similarly, they'll have a resistance management section on the tab. And in some cases, if there are specific laws about how often you're allowed to apply something or in what combinations you can apply this, they'll have very specific directions of what you can or cannot apply at any specific time. All right, so persistence. Persistence is our third category of pesticides. So it's just the amount of time that it takes for a pesticide to degrade in the environment. So basically, when we apply the pesticide, how long do we expect it to hang around before it is no longer effective? And the way we measure this is through the use of half-life, or the amount of time it takes for a material to be reduced to 1/2 of the amount of active ingredient that we originally applied. So basically, when we apply it, we are theoretically at 100% of the total amount of active ingredient. How long does it take for half of that, or 50% of it, to disappear? And then, so that would essentially be what we would call the first half-life, or the reduction to 50%. From there, you could get to the second half-life, which is the reduction of 50% from the first half-life. So that means going from 50% to 1/4%, or 25%. And then the third half-life would be half of that, so going down to 12%. Fourth life is 6%, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially, what we expect is that the total amount of the pesticide will just reduce sort of along this linear scale that it'll always reduce by 1/2 every single step of the way. So if we had a, say, initial, let's say the half-life for a pesticide was 10 days, we'd expect after 10 days to be at this 50% point, 10 days later to be at that 25%, going down the line.
I had a conversation with this lady from BNSF company, and I was kind of telling her about this, and she said, well, do you know if you spray Roundup and as soon as it touches the soil, it's kind of worthless? And I just didn't I couldn't wrap my head around that, because I always thought, okay, well, Roundup has a half-life, depending on where you're at, maybe have a longer lifespan in Europe, eastern part of the United States, but she was telling me that as soon as that Roundup hits the soil, it kind of, it's not going to do what it's supposed to do anymore, because it's a systemic pesticide. So it kind of threw this whole life and a half-life thing out for me.
At least in terms of Roundup.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'm not super familiar with Roundup just because I haven't made a study of herbicides, but so it is a systemic?
Yes.
Okay.
Just because it's not effective in controlling weeds doesn't mean it's still not potentially toxic if you consume it.
Right. If you spill it on the soil, you don't want to pick up that soil and put it on your car.
But she said it essentially becoming active, so
That's kind of weird. I wonder if it's just because it is systemic, and if it's in the soil, it's not going to be absorbed by any plant.
I would be kind of curious. I would be interested to talk to her and see what she means, because I imagine I could see it. I could see why you would say that it is effectively useless
As an herbicide.
as an herbicide, but I think that sounds like the kind of thing you say, but there's like a little asterisk after it, and then it has a couple caveats that explain why it is effectively useless. Oh, well, hey, there we go.
So you got a car.
Come on, don't be like this phone. All right, here in Fresno, easy. All right. But yeah, so that brings up, I guess, an important point, which is that, like Aldo said, the half-life can be highly variable depending on the conditions of the environment. And so once a pesticide is applied, how quickly it breaks down may depend on a lot of things, such as the exposure to light, the amount of rainfall, presence of soil-borne microbes. And so I would be curious with something like, with Roundup, if there is something about the soil that degrades it very quickly, or if it's some aspect of it that it's not capable of actually getting into the plant anymore, or at least causing toxicity problems in the plant. I would be kind of curious. But for example, this permethrin, someone did a study where they essentially put permethrin out in a variety of different environments, and they looked at how long it persisted in the environment. And what they found was this tremendous variability depending on the location and the climactic sort of conditions, as well as the specific places you place the permethrin in the environment. So when it was placed in the soil, on average the half-life was about 40 days. But that really ranged. In some places, you can see, now I'm trying to remember which application this was in particular, but either way, they had areas where it ranged from anywhere as short as 11 days to almost a third of a year at 113. In water, they found that it would break down very quickly in less than a day in all cases, except there were some caveats, which is that if it was bound to soil molecules before it got in the water, it would last for well over a year because it was bound onto some sort of stable matter. Plant surfaces tended to be relatively short, 1 to 3 weeks, but that varied according to which plant it was. So certain crops had a longer half-life than other ones did. And then within the indoors, it was the most variable possible. That they had things ranging from almost immediate degradation to well over 20 days, just based on what the conditions were like indoors, the amount of disruption, the amount of cleaning, all sorts of things that were going on. And so half-life is a useful tool. It gives us a basic idea for how long these things hang out in the environment, that generally if you have two chemicals and one of them says it has a half-life of 20 days, one of them says it has a half-life of 40 days, it's pretty much a safe bet that the one with 40 days is going to persist longer. But will it persist for those 40 days? Maybe not. Maybe it'll go longer, maybe it'll go shorter. Might depend on the conditions that it's under. The other thing that should be pointed out, well, actually, before I get to that. So in general, persistence is considered a good thing if you have a pest that you expect to keep showing up over and over and over again. So if you're working with something like aphids, where you can spray them, but they're immediately just going to start cloning themselves again, it's handy to have nice, long persistence in the field so that you're getting control over a longer period of time. However, there is a trade-off here, that the longer something hangs out in the environment, the more potential danger it poses to non-target organisms, to the potential chance that something's going to wander into the field and get a bit of a dose.
Doesn't it encourage resistance as well? You should put in constant pressure.
Yep, exactly. Point 3, which is exactly the idea, right? That the more you expose a pest to a particular pesticide, the faster it's going to evolve resistance. So the more persistent it is, the more you do have a risk that you're going to get resistance in the population. The more persistent it is, the more resistance there is. Oh, that's a bad rhyme scheme. Should submit that to IPM tongue twisters or something like that.
Is there such a site?
No. Not yet, but living in the internet age, you can make any site you want. All right, maybe I should do that and make it an extra credit assignment just so you'll have to suffer the indignity of writing an IPM tongue twister. Anyway, it's not about indignity. And finally, a point that was brought up is the idea that just because something is broken down, that doesn't mean it's safe. Oftentimes, the breakdown products actually can be more toxic than the initial compound that was put out. For example, imidacloprid breaks down into olefin, which is actually 10 times more toxic to insects than imidacloprid is itself. And so just because it's not imidacloprid anymore doesn't mean that it's not out there killing bugs. All right, and finally, selectivity. I left this in because I felt like it was important just to group it here, but we've already gone over selectivity. So I'm not going to go into great gouts of detail. Again, the basic idea that there are broad-spectrum pesticides, which kill a wide range of pests, but also will kill a wide range of non-targets that are in the same area of sort of the same order, same category of life. So these are generally organisms that share the same site of action, so that they are all vulnerable to the same mode of action. And then you've got selective pesticides, right? Those that target a very unique pest group. So a very narrow focus of toxicity. And again, as is the standard in IPM, selective pesticides are preferred. And as I mentioned in the last lecture as well, you can apply broad-spectrum pesticides in a way that is selective, provided that you get them to the pest in such a way that they are unlikely to contact non-target organisms. So these would be things like baits. If you put the toxic compound into some sort of thing that is only appealing to the pest, or systemics, since those are taken up by the plant, only things that feed on the plant, so by definition, pests will end up getting a dose, or by directed spraying, so going out and like spraying individual weed plots, so that you're making sure you're not hitting those non-targets. However, my graduate advisor is doing some research. He's interested in how systemic pesticides move up food chains in insects, and they're finding a little bit of evidence to suggest that these systemics can build up inside of aphids and get transferred over to beetles and the like. So it's still better than dosing a beetle directly, but there may be a little bit of movement up the trophic chain. And then finally, we have toxicity, which is, as we mentioned before, the capacity of the particular compound to cause injury to organisms. And as we mentioned before, all pesticides are toxic to some organisms. And so when we talk about toxicity in terms of pesticides, what we're really talking about is how hazardous is this compound to people, to the applicator, and to those non-target organisms that are out there. So we're not really interested in whether it's more or less toxic to the pest. We're interested in how safe is this particular compound to be used by applicators and to be used in the environment. So generally, pesticides are broken down into 4 toxicity classes. And these classes are given a number as well as a signal word, which gives you a rough idea of just how dangerous they are. So at the very highest, you have class 1 pesticides. These are the very most toxic. They are given the label danger. And these are compounds that if you consumed as little as 5 grams, you would have a fatal reaction. So that's about 5 grams of a granular. You're probably talking about a tablespoon or so. So still a fairly large amount, but if you were to say someone did something stupid and like put a mixed pesticide in a tea bottle and you took a swig out of it, it's not inconceivable you could get 5 grams. You got class 2s, which are moderately toxic. Their warning word is, well, warning, signal word. These are fatal to humans in slightly larger doses, 3 to 30. Class 3 are just slightly toxic. They have a signal word of caution. And you're talking more than 30 grams, which is a pretty hefty amount of pesticide to ingest directly. And then you've got class 4s, which don't have a signal word because they are practically non-toxic. So these are considered to be not of any significant danger to humans. If you were to say get them in your eyes or up your nose or something, it might be very unpleasant, but it's not going to kill you. And then finally, last point I wanted to touch on was that as far as toxicity is concerned, some pesticides are grouped as restricted use pesticides. And what this means, or RUPs, are just any pesticides where the potential for them to cause adverse reactions in the environment or injuries to people are high enough that you can't buy them on the free market, that you have to buy them through a certified applicator, or at least you need to have a certified applicator apply them to your fields. So these are just generally chemicals that aren't available to the general public. They must be applied by a certified pesticide applicator, which is a completely different license from a PCA license. You have to go through a whole different set of training to get that. Typically, well not typically, by law, all products that are restricted use will have a big thing that says restricted use pesticide right at the top of the label, typically right above the part that says what the product is. So there's really no way to not know that it is restricted use if you take a look at it. We got enough time. So, as far as pesticide classifications are concerned, how we organize pesticides, one way that we do get at that is with mode of entry, so how the pesticides get into the pest's body. So this covers a lot of the things we talked about before, the idea of systemics, or pesticides that are picked up by plants and transported through the vascular. We've got things like translaminars, which are pesticides that are absorbed by the plant but don't actually enter the vascular system. So if you were to spray them on the plant, it would pick it up into the leaves where it had contact, but it wouldn't then go down to the roots or anything. It would just be in the area where you contacted it. And then you've got contact pesticides, which essentially the pests must physically touch or actually physically consume on the outside of the plant in order to sustain an injury. Within those categories, of course, pesticides are grouped according to the organisms they harm, so things like insecticides, herbicides, fungicides. And then within those categories, the most common way to organize them is by the chemistry they use or the mode of action. So typically that's kind of the way you'll see it, is you'll have, it's an insecticide, it's systemic, and it's a neonicotinoid or something like that. So next week, we're going to finish off pesticides, and then we're going to move into pheromones and things like mating disruption and trapping and the like, so sort of a little bit more of a detailed look at what we talked about with forest. And then in lab, we'll be over in 119. We have a guest speaker from Gartutelian, Dave Marler. He's actually the PCA that Fresno State uses out on the farm. So he's going to be talking to us about just sort of PCA work, how he uses IPM in the field, and some aspects of chemical control like written recommendation, liability, odds and ends like that. So that should be an interesting time. With that, we're done, and see y'all at 2 o'clock or next week.